The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as students filed in, finding their usual seats among the tiered rows. Room 302 of the science building at Westfield University always felt a bit cold, no matter the season. Today was no different as a chill hung in the air, though many wondered if it was just the effect Professor Richardson had on any space he occupied. Professor Maxwell Richardson walked in precisely at 10 a.m. as he always did. He was a tall man in his 50s with steel gray hair and rectangular glasses that he used more for looking over than through. His reputation preceded him: 20 years of teaching advanced calculus, 8 published textbooks, and countless students who had either been inspired or intimidated into mathematical excellence. "Today," he announced without preamble, placing his worn leather briefcase on the desk, "we venture into territory that separates the merely competent from the truly exceptional." The shuffling of papers and clicking of pens immediately stopped. 60 students sat up straighter, their attention locked on the professor who never wasted words and never repeated himself. "Open your notebooks," Richardson said, turning to the whiteboard with marker in hand. "I'm about to show you a problem that has fascinated and frustrated mathematicians for the better part of 2 decades. The marker squeaked against the board as he wrote a complex integration formula. The equation sprawled across the board in Richardson's precise handwriting, taking up nearly the entire space. It involved multiple variables, nested integrals, and a conditional boundary that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. "This," Richardson said, tapping the board with his knuckle, "is what we call a properly challenging problem." He turned to face the classroom, surveying the sea of young faces. Some stared at the equation with furrowed brows. Others were already scribbling in their notebooks, attempting to make sense of what they were seeing. A few looked completely lost. "The Kaufman-Reed integration problem," Richardson continued, "first proposed at the International Mathematics Symposium in 2002, and still without an elegant solution. Several partial solutions exist, of course, but they're all cumbersome, requiring computational brute force rather than mathematical insight." Tom Chin, a front-row student known for his quickness, raised his hand. "Professor, isn't this related to the work being done in computational fluid dynamics?" Richardson nodded, the barest hint of approval crossing his face. "Indeed, which is precisely why it matters. This isn't just abstract mathematics. Solutions to this class of problems could revolutionize everything from weather prediction to aerospace engineering." He paced slowly across the front of the room. "I've presented this problem at 3 universities and 2 research institutions. I've watched doctoral candidates struggle with it for months. I've seen tenured professors develop promising approaches that ultimately failed." The silence in the room deepened. Even the usual whispers had stopped. "I want to be clear," Richardson said, his voice dropping slightly, giving his words added weight. "I'm not presenting this as your assignment. I'm not expecting solutions on my desk next week. I'm showing you this problem because it represents the beautiful complexity at the frontier of mathematical thought." He paused, looking directly at the class, "and because I believe it's currently impossible to solve with our existing mathematical framework." A collective breath seemed to release around the room. Some shoulders relaxed; they wouldn't be tested on the impossible. Others leaned forward, intrigued by the challenge that even their formidable professor considered beyond reach. "However," Richardson continued, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth, "mathematics advances when the impossible becomes possible. So I invite you, not as an assignment but as fellow travelers on this mathematical journey, to consider this problem. Spend time with it. Let it challenge you." He turned back to the board, adding additional context and constraints to the problem. "The traditional approaches all fail at this juncture," he explained, circling a particular section. "The boundary conditions create a singularity that prevents straightforward resolution." For the next 40 minutes, Richardson walked them through the history of the problem, previous attempts at solutions, and the mathematical principles at play. His usual stern demeanor softened slightly when discussing mathematics at this level, like a climber describing a majestic but unconquerable mountain peak. Most students took notes diligently, though few fully grasped the depth of what they were being shown. This was beyond their curriculum, beyond what would appear on exams. It was Richardson's way of showing them what lay ahead if they continued in the field, both the challenges and the beauty. In the back row, almost hidden behind a taller student, sat Elena Cortez. At 42, she was more than twice the age of most students in the class. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and faint lines crinkled around her eyes when she concentrated, which she was doing intensely now. Unlike her classmates who wrote furiously, Elena's notebook contained only a few sparse notes. Instead, she stared at the problem, her head tilted slightly as if listening to the mathematics rather than just seeing it. When Richardson circled the supposed impossible section, her eyes narrowed, and she made a single mark on her paper, a question mark with a small arrow pointing to a specific part of her hastily copied equation. Elena had taken a very different path to this classroom. 20 years earlier, she had dropped out of community college to support her family when her father fell ill. Mathematics had always come naturally to her, a secret language that made perfect sense while words sometimes failed her. But life had required other priorities, working multiple jobs, helping raise her younger siblings, building a modest life. Now with her family grown and stable, she had returned to education, taking night classes and working as a janitor at an elementary school to pay her tuition. This class with the famous Professor Richardson was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had fought hard to qualify for it, spending countless hours in the library catching up on the prerequisites. As the lecture continued, Elena saw something in the equation that bothered her, not because it was difficult, but because it reminded her of patterns she had observed years ago when teaching herself calculus during lunch breaks. The way the variables interacted at the boundary condition triggered a memory of something she had read about theoretical approaches to infinity sequences. When Richardson finished his lecture and asked if there were any questions, Elena almost raised her hand, but decades of being overlooked had taught her caution. Instead, she waited until the class ended and approached the professor as he gathered his materials. "Professor Richardson," she said quietly, "I noticed something about the boundary condition in the problem." Richardson glanced up, clearly surprised to be addressed by a student he barely recognized. "Yes?" he said, his tone making it clear that he was not expecting anything of substance. "The singularity at the boundary. It reminds me of Takahashi's work on convergence in infinite series. I wonder if approaching it from that angle might—" "Takahashi?" Richardson interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "That's rather obscure reading for an undergraduate." His tone wasn't exactly dismissive, but it held the clear implication that she might be out of her depth. "I read widely," Elena replied simply. Richardson closed his briefcase. Takahashi's methods would fail here for the same reason others have. The dimensional constraints are fundamentally different. He checked his watch. "I have a faculty meeting. If you're interested in this problem, I suggest starting with Kovalev's 2016 paper on partial solutions. The library should have it." With that, he nodded curtly and left, already mentally moving on to his next obligation. Elena stood alone in the emptying classroom, looking at the complex equation still written on the board. She wasn't offended by the dismissal. It was actually more attention than she usually received. And Richardson hadn't been wrong about Takahashi's approach having limitations. But as she copied down the remaining details of the problem, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was another way to look at it. Something about the structure of the equation kept tugging at her thoughts, like a half-remembered melody. That night, after her shift mopping floors and cleaning bathrooms at Oak Ridge Elementary, Elena sat at her small kitchen table with the problem spread out before her. The apartment was quiet, a rare gift in her busy life. A single lamp cast a warm circle of light over her work as the clock on the microwave blinked 11:42 p.m. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered to the equation, as if it were a living thing with secrets to share. She began breaking it down, not following any formal method she had learned in class, but trusting the intuitive approach that had always served her when traditional education wasn't available. Somewhere, hidden in the complexity, was a pattern waiting to be found, and Elena had always been good at finding patterns. Elena didn't make it to bed until nearly 3 a.m. The problem Professor Richardson had presented kept her mind racing long after her body begged for rest. She had filled 5 pages of her notebook with different approaches, crossing out dead ends and circling promising paths. When she finally did sleep, numbers and symbols danced behind her eyelids. The alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m. Elena reached over and silenced it before it could ring twice. Years of early mornings had trained her body to wake quickly, though today it protested more than usual. She moved quietly through her morning routine, shower, coffee, a quick breakfast of toast and an apple, while reviewing her notes from the night before. "There's something there," she murmured to herself, tapping a pencil against the edge of her coffee mug. "I just can't quite see it yet." Her day job at Sunshine Daycare started at 7 a.m. 3 days a week she helped with the morning shift before heading to campus for afternoon classes. The other 2 weekdays, like today, she had Professor Richardson's morning class followed by her evening janitorial work at the elementary school. The schedule was exhausting but necessary. Both jobs combined barely covered her tuition and living expenses. As she drove to campus in her old Honda with the squeaky belt, Elena mentally reviewed the problem again. The car knew the route so well she sometimes felt it could drive itself, leaving her mind free to wander through mathematical landscapes. "The boundary condition is the key," she said aloud. Talking to herself was a habit formed from years of working alone. Everyone's treating it as an obstacle, but what if it's actually the doorway? She arrived at the lecture hall 20 minutes early, choosing the same back row seat. Few students noticed her. The age gap and her quiet demeanor made her nearly invisible among the energetic 20-somethings who traveled in tight social groups. Professor Richardson entered exactly on time, as always. Today he wore a charcoal suit with a deep blue tie, his formal attire a stark contrast to the casual clothes of his students. "Yesterday," he began without preamble, "I introduced you to the Kaufman-Reed integration problem. Today we return to more practical matters, techniques you'll need for your upcoming midterm." A visible wave of relief passed through the classroom. The impossible problem had been interesting, but most students were more concerned with passing the course than pushing mathematical boundaries. For the next hour, Richardson led them through advanced integration methods. His teaching style was precise and demanding, but also strangely captivating. When he explained mathematics, his usual stern expression softened, replaced by genuine enthusiasm for the subject. Even students who feared him couldn't deny his brilliance. Elena took careful notes, appreciating Richardson's clear explanations of concepts she had struggled to teach herself over the years. But part of her mind remained fixed on yesterday's problem, examining it from new angles even as she absorbed the day's lesson. When class ended, she remained seated, adding a few additional notes while the room emptied. Professor Richardson gathered his materials, his movements efficient and practiced. To her surprise, he glanced up at her before leaving. "Did you find Kovalev's paper?" Elena hadn't expected him to remember their brief conversation. "Not yet, Professor. I was approaching it from a different angle first." He raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "I've been considering the boundary as a transformation point rather than a limitation. If we view the singularity as a portal to a different mathematical space rather than an endpoint." She hesitated, suddenly aware of how unconventional her thinking might sound to someone with formal training. Richardson studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "That's an unusual perspective." He checked his watch. "I have office hours this afternoon if you want to discuss it further. 2 to 4. With that he left, leaving Elena staring after him in surprise. Had that been an actual invitation, or just a professor's automatic response to a student's interest? She had to be at work by 3, making it impossible to attend his office hours. The brief window of opportunity closed as quickly as it had opened. She sighed, gathering her books. Perhaps it was for the best. Her half-formed ideas probably weren't ready for Richardson's scrutiny anyway. The day passed in a blur of activity. After class, Elena spent 2 hours in the library, dividing her time between researching the impossible problem and working on assignments for her other courses. Then it was off to Oak Ridge Elementary for her evening shift. Cleaning classrooms gave Elena time to think. There was something meditative about the simple physical tasks, wiping down desks, sweeping floors, emptying trash bins. Her body worked while her mind wandered through mathematical puzzles. "The problem with most approaches," she said softly as she mopped the hallway, "is they try to solve it all at once. But what if it needs to be broken into regions?" A passing security guard gave her an odd look, and Elena realized she'd been talking to herself again. She smiled apologetically and continued working, but the thought had sparked something. Breaking the integration into regions was standard practice, but what if the regions weren't defined by the obvious boundaries? What if there was another way to partition the space? By the time she returned home at 10:30 p.m., a new approach was taking shape in her mind. She barely took time to eat a simple dinner of microwaved leftovers before spreading her notes across the kitchen table. For the next 3 hours, Elena worked steadily, her pencil moving across page after page. She tried 4 different methods of partitioning the space before finding one that seemed promising. The approach was unusual, combining elements of complex analysis with techniques from multivariable calculus in a way she hadn't seen before. "That can't be right," she muttered when her calculations produced a surprisingly simple intermediate result. She checked her work, then checked it again. The simplicity felt suspicious, too good to be true. Mathematical breakthroughs rarely looked so clean on first attempt, yet she couldn't find the error. The approach eliminated the troublesome singularity by transforming it into a traversable point in a higher dimensional space. It was mathematically valid, if unorthodox. Elena rubbed her tired eyes. The digital clock on her microwave showed 2:17 a.m. Another late night, and she had to be up for her daycare shift in just over 3 hours. She should stop, get some sleep, continue tomorrow. But the problem had her in its grip now. The tantalizing possibility that she might have found a path forward kept her pencil moving, her mind alert despite her body's protests. Just one more step, she promised herself, just to see where this leads. The one more step turned into 2, then 5, then a complete reworking of the approach when she hit an unexpected obstacle. By the time Elena finally collapsed into bed, the first hints of dawn were lightening the sky outside her window. She set her alarm for 5:30 a.m. and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next day passed in a fog of exhaustion. She made it through her daycare shift on autopilot, grateful that the children's energy helped keep her awake. Her afternoon class, History of Mathematics, an elective she usually enjoyed, barely registered as she struggled to stay focused. That evening, instead of going straight to her janitorial job, Elena stopped by the university library. She had an hour to spare and wanted to find the Kovalev paper Richardson had mentioned. Maybe it would help validate her approach or show her where she'd gone wrong. The reference librarian, a kind older woman named Mrs. Liu, who had helped Elena navigate the academic world many times before, located the paper in an online journal. "It's quite technical," Mrs. Liu warned. "One of Professor Richardson's specialties, I believe." "Thank you," Elena said, settling at a computer terminal. "I just need to check something specific." The paper was indeed technical, filled with dense mathematical notation and references to other works Elena wasn't familiar with. But the core approach was clear enough. Kovalev had attempted to solve the problem through a series of approximations, each getting closer to the true solution without ever quite reaching it. What caught Elena's attention was a small section near the end, where Kovalev mentioned an alternative approach he had abandoned. It described a transformation similar to what Elena had been considering, though approached from a different angle. "He was so close," Elena whispered, excitement cutting through her fatigue. He almost saw it. She quickly made notes, capturing the key insights from Kovalev's abandoned approach and seeing how they might connect with her own work. The parallels were striking, like they'd been walking the same path but from opposite directions. Elena glanced at her watch and gasped. She was going to be late for W. Orc. Gathering her materials, she hurried from the library, her mind racing faster than her feet. That night, after completing her cleaning duties, Elena returned to the problem with renewed energy. Kovalev's paper had given her both validation and new ideas. Her approach wasn't completely unheard of. A respected mathematician had considered something similar, but she was taking it in a direction he hadn't explored. As Thursday turned to Friday, Elena continued refining her solution. The mathematics flowed more smoothly now, each step leading naturally to the next. The elegance of the emerging solution surprised her. It wasn't just working, it was beautiful. By the time Professor Richardson's Friday class arrived, Elena had something substantial. Not a complete solution, but a solid approach with promising initial results. As she took her seat in the back row, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Should she approach Richardson again? Would he dismiss her ideas as amateur musings, or would he see the potential she believed was there? The professor entered the room and immediately launched into a lecture on Taylor series applications. Elena listened attentively, waiting for the right moment. when Richardson eventually referenced the impossible problem from earlier in the week, comparing aspects of it to the day's topic. She knew her opportunity had come. The class ended. Students filed out and Elena took a deep breath. With her notebook clutched in slightly trembling hands, she made her way to the front of the room where Professor Richardson was erasing the whiteboard. "Professor," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, "about the Kaufman-Reed problem. I think I may have found an approach worth considering." Professor Richardson turned from the whiteboard, a hint of surprise crossing his face when he saw Elena standing there. He hadn't expected any students to linger after class, especially on a Friday afternoon, when the campus quickly emptied for the weekend. "Ms. Cortez, isn't it?" he asked, setting down the eraser. Elena nodded, somewhat surprised he remembered her name. "Yes, sir. I wanted to show you something, if you have a minute." Richardson glanced at his watch, a habitual gesture that students knew well. "I have exactly 7 minutes before a department meeting." "I'll be quick," Elena promised, opening her notebook to the pages she'd filled over the past 3 nights. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it on the desk. These calculations represented not just mathematical work, but countless hours stolen from sleep. From her rare moments of rest between jobs and classes. The professor scanned the first page with a practiced eye, his expression neutral. Elena stood silently, fighting the urge to explain or justify her approach. Richardson flipped to the second page, then the third. His eyebrows rose fractionally. "You've combined Takahashi's convergence theory with elements of transformational geometry," he observed, his tone carefully measured. "An unconventional approach." "Yes," Elena said. "I thought about what you said regarding the boundary conditions, but instead of seeing them as limitations, I tried viewing them as transformation points." Richardson nodded slowly, continuing to examine her work. "And this section here?" He pointed to a particularly dense set of calculations. "You're essentially creating a new coordinate system at the boundary?" "A localized one, yes. It allows the integration to continue through what appeared to be a singularity in the standard framework." The professor's eyes narrowed, not in disapproval, but in focused concentration. He flipped back to the first page, then forward again, tracing the progression of Elena's logic. "This is," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "This shows genuine insight, Ms. Cortez. There are issues with the approach here and here." He pointed to 2 sections of her work. "But the core idea has merit." Coming from Professor Richardson, this was extraordinary praise. Elena felt a rush of validation that nearly made her lightheaded. "I've been trying to address those issues," she said, turning to the final pages of her notes. "I think if we apply a modified form of..." The door to the classroom opened, and a younger professor, Dr. Lee from the physics department, stuck his head in. "Max, the meeting's starting. Dean Williams is already there." Richardson nodded to his colleague. "I'll be right there." He turned back to Elena. "I need to go, but this..." He tapped her notebook. "This deserves further discussion. My office hours on Monday, 2 to 4. Can you make it?" Elena hesitated. Monday afternoons, she worked at the daycare center. Missing a shift would cost her badly needed income. "But this opportunity..." "I'll be there," she said. "Thank you, Professor." Richardson gathered his materials. "Bring all your work, especially any progress you make over the weekend. And take a look at Vishwanathan's paper on non-Euclidean integration techniques. It might help with the issues in your approach." With that, he strode from the room, leaving Elena standing by the desk, a mixture of excitement and anxiety swirling in her chest. Her approach had merit. Professor Richardson, one of the most respected mathematicians she knew of, had said her work showed genuine insight. She carefully closed her notebook, a smile spreading across her face. For the first time since she'd returned to her education, Elena felt like she truly belonged in the academic world. The weekend passed in a blur of calculation, work shifts, and minimal sleep. Elena called her supervisor at the daycare center and arranged to switch her Monday afternoon shift with Tuesday morning. It meant working 16 hours straight on Tuesday between both jobs, but the opportunity to discuss her approach with Richardson was worth the exhaustion that would follow. She spent every spare minute refining her solution, addressing the issues Richardson had pointed out, and incorporating ideas from Vishwanathan's paper, which she found in the university's online journal collection. The mathematics was challenging, pushing the limits of her self-taught knowledge. But the core approach continued to hold promise. By Monday afternoon, Elena had a substantially improved version of her solution. The transformation at the boundary was more elegantly handled, and she'd found a way to simplify the resulting integration. It wasn't complete. Several steps still required refinement, but it was solid progress. She arrived at Richardson's office 15 minutes early, clutching her notebook and a folder containing additional work, too extensive to fit in the original pages. The hallway in the mathematics department was quiet, most students still in classes or avoiding office hours unless absolutely necessary. Elena sat on a bench outside Richardson's office, reviewing her notes one last time. She wanted to be prepared for any questions or challenges he might raise. The butterflies in her stomach reminded her of her first day back at college after a 20-year absence. That same mixture of excitement and fear, of feeling simultaneously too old and too inexperienced. At exactly 2 o'clock, the office door opened. A young man exited, looking slightly shell-shocked, the typical expression of students after a one-on-one session with the demanding professor. "Ms. Cortez," Richardson called from inside, having spotted her through the open door. "Come in." Elena entered the office, taking in the space that reflected its occupant perfectly. Bookshelves lined 3 walls filled with neatly arranged mathematics texts and journals. The desk was large but uncluttered, with papers stacked in precise piles. A window overlooked the campus quad, though the blinds were partially closed, filtering the afternoon sunlight. "Have a seat," Richardson said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. As Elena sat down, she noticed a copy of her notebook pages on his desk, with annotations in red pen throughout. "You've reviewed my work," she observed, surprised and oddly touched that he'd taken the time. "Of course," Richardson replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to spend his weekend studying a student's approach to an impossible problem. "You raised interesting possibilities. I wanted to understand them fully." Elena placed her folder on the desk. "I've made some revisions based on your feedback and the Vishwanathan paper." Richardson opened the folder, examining the new work with the same intense concentration he'd shown on Friday. The office was silent except for the ticking of a wall clock and the occasional sound of a page turning. After several minutes, he looked up. "You've addressed many of the issues we discussed. The transformation at the boundary is particularly elegant now." He leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, Ms. Cortez, where did you learn this approach?" "It's not standard curriculum." Elena hesitated. How could she explain her mathematical education? "The books borrowed from libraries during lunch breaks. The online courses taken at midnight after exhausting workdays. The problems worked out on the backs of order forms while waiting for her shift to end." "I'm largely self-taught," she said simply. "Before returning to university, I studied independently for many years." "Self-taught," Richardson repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yet you're familiar with Takahashi's work and able to extend it in meaningful ways." "I read whatever I could find," Elena explained. "Sometimes the connections between different mathematical approaches are clearer when you encounter them outside of formal education, without being told which techniques belong to which disciplines." Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "There's merit to that perspective. Academic silos can sometimes limit creative thinking." He tapped the papers. "This approach shows promise, but there are still significant challenges ahead." For the next hour, Richardson and Elena discussed the problem, exploring the strengths and weaknesses of her approach. He challenged her assumptions, pointed out potential pitfalls, and occasionally nodded with approval when her responses demonstrated solid understanding. Elena felt her initial nervousness fade as the conversation progressed. Despite his intimidating reputation, Richardson treated her ideas with genuine respect, engaging with the mathematics rather than dismissing it because it came from an older, non-traditional student. As their discussion wound down, Richardson gathered the papers together. "You've made remarkable progress. Ms. Cortez, this approach deserves further development." "Thank you, Professor," Elena said, feeling a warm glow of accomplishment. "I have a proposal," Richardson continued, his tone becoming more formal. "The department hosts a weekly seminar series where faculty and graduate students present ongoing research. Occasionally, we invite exceptional undergraduates to participate as well." Elena's heart began to beat faster. "I'd like you to present this work next Wednesday," Richardson said. It's incomplete, yes, but the approach is novel enough to warrant discussion among a wider mathematical audience. Elena stared at him, momentarily speechless. The seminar series was well known among mathematics students, a prestigious forum where cutting-edge research was shared and debated. You want me to present? To the department? She finally managed. Yes, Richardson confirmed. 20 minutes to outline your approach, followed by questions. It would be an opportunity to receive feedback from colleagues who might see aspects we've overlooked. The thought of presenting to a room full of professors and graduate students made Elena's stomach clench with anxiety. Public speaking had never been her strength, and explaining complex mathematics to experts was particularly daunting. I'm not sure I'm ready for that, she admitted. Richardson studied her face. The mathematics is ready, Ms. Cortez. The question is whether you are. His words hung in the air between them. Elena knew this was more than an invitation to give a talk. It was an opportunity to be taken seriously as a mathematician, to have her ideas evaluated on their merits rather than being dismissed because of her unorthodox background. What time on Wednesday? She asked, making her decision. 4 o'clock, room 401, Richardson said, the faintest hint of approval in his eyes. I'll email you the details. Prepare slides if you wish, though a whiteboard presentation is equally acceptable. Elena nodded, already mentally reorganizing her work schedule. She'd need to find someone to cover her Wednesday afternoon shift, which wouldn't be easy. But some opportunities couldn't be passed up. Regardless of the cost, as she gathered her materials to leave, Richardson added, your approach may not ultimately solve the problem. Ms. Cortez, most innovative attempts fail. But it's a legitimate contribution to the conversation, and that alone is significant. Coming from Professor Richardson, known for his exacting standards and reluctance to offer praise, these words carried extraordinary weight. Elena left the office with a strange mixture of terror and elation. In just over a week, she would stand before the mathematics department and present her approach to a problem that Professor Richardson had called impossible. As she walked across campus to her evening class, the autumn sun warm on her face, Elena realized something had fundamentally changed. For the first time in decades, she was being recognized not as a janitor or daycare worker, struggling to make ends meet, but as a mathematician with ideas worth hearing. The days leading up to Wednesday's seminar were among the most challenging of Elena's life. She worked double shifts on Tuesday to compensate for taking Wednesday afternoon off, coming home so exhausted she nearly fell asleep in the shower. Every spare moment was dedicated to refining her presentation and strengthening her mathematical approach. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. Between her jobs, regular coursework, and preparing for the seminar, Elena survived on brief naps and too much coffee. Dark circles formed under her eyes, but a determined energy kept her moving forward. This opportunity meant everything. A chance to be taken seriously in a world that had often overlooked her. On Tuesday evening, Elena practiced her presentation in her tiny apartment, using the refrigerator as a makeshift whiteboard. She walked through each step methodically, explaining the logic of her approach aloud, as if speaking to an audience of experts. The traditional methods fail at the boundary because they treat it as a barrier, she explained to her empty kitchen. But if we introduce a transformation at precisely that point, we can continue the integration through what appeared to be a singularity. Her cat, Pythagoras, a stray she'd adopted years ago, watched from the counter with apparent interest, tail swishing occasionally as if in approval. The question is whether my transformation is mathematically valid, Elena continued, writing another equation on the refrigerator with dry erase marker. Professor Richardson thinks it might be. She paused, wiping away a section to correct an error. The whiteboard markers had been an extravagant purchase given her tight budget, but necessary for practice. She'd carefully researched which brand would wash off appliances without leaving stains. By midnight, Elena had run through the entire presentation 4 times. Each rehearsal helped solidify the mathematical concepts in her mind and smooth out her explanation. She wasn't naturally comfortable with public speaking, but the mathematics itself gave her confidence. She understood this approach on a deep level. It wasn't just memorized steps, but a pathway she'd discovered through persistent exploration. At 1:30 a.m., Elena finally allowed herself to sleep, setting her alarm for 5 a.m. to review her notes one last time before heading to her morning class. Wednesday arrived with gray skies and a light drizzle that seemed to match Elena's nervous mood. She attended her morning classes with only half her attention, her mind constantly drifting to equations and explanations. During lunch, she sat alone in a corner of the cafeteria, reviewing her notes and making small adjustments to her approach. At 3:30 p.m., Elena arrived at room 401 in the mathematics building. The seminar wasn't scheduled to begin until 4:00, but she wanted time to collect her thoughts and get comfortable with the space. To her surprise, the room was already half full with early arrivers, professors and graduate students engaged in quiet conversation. Elena slipped into a seat near the back, clutching her folder of notes. She hadn't expected such a large audience. Richardson's email had mentioned that the weekly seminars typically attracted about 20 people from the department. Today there appeared to be twice that number. As 4:00 p.m. approached, the room continued to fill. Elena recognized several professors from the mathematics department, as well as a few faces from physics and computer science. Graduate students occupied most of the remaining seats, with a sprinkling of advanced undergraduates near the back. At precisely 4:00 p.m., Professor Richardson entered and made his way to the front of the room. The murmur of conversation died down as he turned to address the audience. "Good afternoon, colleagues and students," he began. "Today's seminar features a novel approach to the Kaufman-Reed integration problem, which, as many of you know, has resisted conventional solutions for nearly 2 decades. A ripple of interest moved through the audience. The problem was well known among mathematicians, particularly those specializing in complex analysis and multivariable calculus. Our presenter is Elena Cortez, an undergraduate in my advanced calculus course, who has developed an unconventional but promising approach to this challenge." All eyes turned toward the front, searching for the presenter. Richardson looked toward the back of the room, finding Elena. "Ms. Cortez, if you're ready." Elena stood, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. She made her way to the front, her folder clutched tightly in slightly trembling hands. As she reached the whiteboard, she took a deep breath, remembering the countless times she'd practiced in her kitchen. "Thank you, Professor Richardson," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "As many of you know, the Kaufman-Reed problem involves an integration with boundary conditions that create what appears to be an insurmountable singularity." She wrote the original equation on the board, her handwriting neat and precise despite her nervousness. 20 years of taking notes while standing had given her excellent board skills. Traditional approaches attempt to work around this singularity through approximation or computational methods. Elena continued. "My approach differs in that it treats the boundary not as a barrier, but as a transformation point." For the next 15 minutes, Elena walked through her solution step by step. After the initial nervousness, she found herself settling into the rhythm of the mathematics, focusing on the logic of her approach rather than the audience watching her. Occasionally, she glanced at Professor Richardson, whose expression remained neutral but attentive. "The key insight," Elena explained, writing a complex transformation on the board, "is that by shifting to this alternative framework at precisely the boundary point, we can continue the integration through what appeared to be a singularity in the standard coordinate system." A murmur ran through the audience. Elena paused, allowing the implications to sink in. She noticed several graduate students leaning forward in their seats, while a few professors were already scribbling notes. "This transformation," she continued, "allows us to rewrite the problem in a form that, while still complex, no longer contains the problematic singularity." She moved to the final section of her presentation, showing how the transformed equation could be integrated using modified versions of standard techniques. As she wrote the resulting expression on the board, the room grew very quiet. "The solution isn't complete," Elena admitted, turning to face the audience. "There are still sections that require refinement, and the transformation itself needs rigorous validation. But the initial results suggest this approach may offer a path forward where traditional methods have stalled." She stepped back from the board, indicating the end of her formal presentation. "Thank you for your attention. I welcome your questions and feedback." For a moment, the room remained silent as the audience processed what they had just seen. Then hands began to rise throughout the room. Professor Richardson pointed to a gray-haired woman in the front row, Dr. Patel, the department's specialist in multivariable calculus. Your transformation appears to have elements of both Takahashi's convergence theory and Vishwanathan's non-Euclidean techniques, Dr. Patel observed. Yet you've combined them in a way I haven't seen before. How did you arrive at this particular formulation? Elena took a breath before answering. I approach the problem without preconceived notions about which techniques should be applied. By focusing on the mathematical structure itself rather than established categories, I found connections between approaches that might otherwise seem unrelated. Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. Have you verified the transformation preserves all the necessary properties at the boundary? Not rigorously, Elena admitted. That's one of the areas requiring further work. I verified it for specific cases, but a general proof is still in development. The questions continued for nearly 30 minutes, coming from professors and graduate students alike. Some were skeptical, challenging the validity of her approach or pointing out potential weaknesses. Others were genuinely curious, exploring the implications of her method or suggesting extensions. Throughout the questioning, Elena maintained her composure, answering confidently when she knew the answers and freely admitting when she didn't. That's an excellent point I haven't fully addressed yet, she would say, or I'll need to explore that aspect further. As the seminar approached its conclusion, Professor Richardson stepped forward. One final question, he said, looking directly at Elena. Your transformation appears to create a pathway through the singularity, but doesn't fully eliminate the computational challenges. Do you believe this approach can lead to a complete, elegant solution to the Kaufman-Reed problem? The room fell silent. It was the question everyone had been thinking, but no. One had directly asked, could this unconventional approach from an undergraduate student actually solve a problem that had stumped experts for nearly 2 decades? Elena met Richardson's gaze. I believe it can, she said simply. The mathematical framework is sound, and while challenges remain, they appear to be technical rather than fundamental. With further development, I believe this approach offers a genuine path to solution. Richardson's expression remained unreadable, but he nodded slightly. Thank you, Ms. Cortez, for a thought-provoking presentation. He turned to the audience. This concludes today's seminar. Next week, Professor Yamamoto will discuss recent advances in topological data analysis. As people began gathering their things, several approached Elena at the front of the room. Graduate students asked for copies of her notes, while a few professors offered specific suggestions for addressing the remaining challenges in her approach. Dr. Patel, who had asked the first question, shook Elena's hand warmly. Refreshing to see such creative thinking, she said. If you're interested in discussing this further, my office hours are Thursday afternoons. Elena thanked her, almost dizzy from the unexpected positive reception. For years she had worked in isolation, her mathematical abilities largely unrecognized. Now suddenly she was at the center of serious academic discussion. As the room gradually emptied, Professor Richardson approached, carrying his briefcase. You handled that well, he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Particularly the questions about validation. Thank you for the opportunity, Elena replied. The feedback will be invaluable for refining the approach. Richardson studied her for a moment. Your presentation has generated significant interest. I've already received emails from colleagues asking to be kept informed of your progress. Elena blinked in surprise. Really? Indeed. Dr. Chen from Applied Mathematics is particularly interested in potential applications to fluid dynamics problems. Richardson checked his watch, that familiar gesture. We should discuss next steps. My office tomorrow at 3? Elena nodded, already mentally rearranging her work schedule again. I'll be there. As she gathered her materials, Richardson added, You should know, Ms. Cortez, that in 20 years of teaching, I've never seen an undergraduate approach a problem of this complexity with such insight. Whatever comes of this particular solution, you've demonstrated remarkable mathematical thinking. With that, he left, leaving Elena alone in the seminar room, her equations still covering the whiteboard. She stood there for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. Then slowly she erased the board, carefully preserving every equation in her notes before leaving. Outside, the earlier drizzle had stopped and weak sunlight broke through the clouds. As Elena walked across campus, her exhaustion temporarily forgotten, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in a very long time, pride in being recognized. For her mind rather than her labor, The next 6 weeks transformed Elena's life in ways she could never have imagined. After her seminar presentation, word spread quickly through the mathematics department about the unconventional approach to the Kaufman-Reed problem. What began as a curious sidebar in departmental conversation soon became a topic of serious academic interest. Elena continued working with Professor Richardson, meeting twice weekly to refine her approach. The transformation technique that formed the core of her solution proved more robust than initially expected, surviving rigorous mathematical scrutiny and extending to cases beyond the original problem. "We need to formalize this," Richardson said during their 4th meeting, pushing a legal pad across his desk with notes scribbled in his precise handwriting. "I've outlined a structure for a proper academic paper. You should be the primary author, with me as co-author to provide context and background." Elena stared at the pad, momentarily speechless. Publishing in an academic journal was a milestone she hadn't dared to imagine, at least not for many years to come. "A paper?" she finally managed. "You think it's ready for that?" "Not yet," Richardson admitted with his characteristic directness. "But it will be. The core insight is sound, and the remaining issues are resolving themselves as we work through them." He leaned back in his chair. "More importantly, this approach deserves to be shared with the broader mathematical community." The following weeks settled into an exhausting but exhilarating rhythm. Elena continued her jobs at the daycare center and elementary school, though she had reduced her hours slightly to make time for the research. Every available moment was dedicated to developing the paper with Richardson, working through each section methodically. On a rainy Tuesday in November, Dr. Patel joined one of their working sessions, bringing expertise in multivariable calculus that helped resolve one of the trickier aspects of the transformation. The 3 mathematicians worked for hours at Richardson's whiteboard, Elena often leading the discussion as they refined the approach. "The beauty of this solution," Dr. Patel observed as they concluded, "is that it doesn't just solve one problem. It offers a framework that could be applied to an entire class of similar challenges." She smiled at Elena. "You've opened a door, not just found a key." By early December, the paper was taking its final form. Integration Beyond Boundaries, a transformational approach to the Kaufman-Reed problem, by Elena Cortez and Maxwell Richardson. Elena still felt a jolt of disbelief each time she saw her name listed as primary author. Throughout this period, she continued attending her regular classes, though her perspective had subtly shifted. She was no longer just a student absorbing information, but a contributor to mathematical knowledge. In class discussions, she spoke more confidently, her questions more incisive, her understanding deeper. Her classmates noticed the change too, especially after word spread about her work with Richardson. Some were obviously curious about the older student who had suddenly become a departmental talking point. Others reached out directly, forming study groups that benefited from Elena's patient explanations and intuitive understanding of complex concepts. "You have a gift for teaching," one young student told her after Elena had walked the group through a particularly challenging topic. "You make the impossible seem possible." The comment stayed with Elena, resonating with her own journey. Wasn't that exactly what she had done with the Kaufman-Reed problem? Taken something labeled impossible and found a pathway through it? As the fall semester drew to a close, Elena faced a critical decision. Dr. Chen from Applied Mathematics had approached her with an offer, a paid research position working on applications of her transformation technique to fluid dynamics problems. The stipend wasn't large, but it would allow her to reduce her working hours further, possibly even quit one of her jobs entirely. "You should take it," Richardson advised when she mentioned the offer during one of their meetings. "Your mathematical abilities deserve focused development." Elena twisted a pencil between her fingers, considering. "It would mean quitting my position at the daycare." "Those kids," she paused. "I've watched some of them grow for years." Richardson nodded, his expression softening slightly. "A difficult choice. But remember that your contributions to mathematics may ultimately help many more people, including children, in ways you can't yet see." The week before final exams, Elena made her decision. She would accept the research position starting in the spring semester and reduce her janitorial work to 2 evenings per week. It meant a tight budget even with the stipend, but for the first time in her adult life, Her primary focus would be on her mathematical work. On the last day of classes, Professor Richardson's advanced calculus course gathered for their final session before exams. The atmosphere was tense, as it always was at semester's end, with students anxiously calculating what grades they needed on the final to achieve their desired course outcomes. Richardson entered exactly on time, as always carrying his familiar briefcase. He surveyed the room before speaking. "Before we begin our review session, I have an announcement," he said. The room fell silent immediately. "The paper Integration Beyond Boundaries, co-authored by myself and Ms. Cortez," he nodded toward Elena in her usual back row seat, "has been accepted by the Journal of Mathematical Analysis and Applications." A murmur ran through the classroom. Being published in JMAA, a respected peer-reviewed journal, was a significant achievement, especially for an undergraduate. Furthermore, Richardson continued when the room quieted, the review committee specifically noted that the approach represents a substantial contribution to the field and opens promising avenues for addressing previously intractable problems. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "In plain language, Ms. Cortez has solved a problem that I told you at the beginning of the semester was impossible." All eyes turned toward Elena, who felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. Richardson wasn't one for dramatic statements or public praise. For him to acknowledge this so openly was unprecedented. "I share this not to embarrass Ms. Cortez," Richardson continued, "but because it offers a valuable lesson to everyone in this room." He scanned the faces of his students. Mathematics, like life, is full of problems that appear impossible until someone finds a new way to look at them. With that philosophical statement rare from the usually pragmatic professor, Richardson turned to the whiteboard and began the review session. But something had changed in the room. Throughout the class, Elena noticed students looking at her differently, with respect and curiosity rather than the polite indifference they had shown all semester. After class ended, several students approached her, offering congratulations and asking about her approach to the problem. Elena answered their questions patiently, remembering her own hunger for mathematical understanding during all those years of self-study. As the room emptied, Professor Richardson approached, his briefcase in hand. "The spring departmental colloquium has a slot open in February," he said without preamble. "The committee has asked if we would present our paper." Elena nodded, no longer intimidated by the prospect of presenting to a large academic audience. "I'd be happy to." Richardson studied her for a moment. "You've come a long way since our first conversation about this problem. Your confidence has grown." "The mathematics hasn't changed," Elena replied with a small smile. "Just my belief in my ability to understand it." Richardson nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "By the way," he added as he turned to leave, "Dr. Patel mentioned you might consider applying to our graduate program for next fall. The department would likely offer a full scholarship based on your published work." Elena felt her heart skip a beat. Graduate school had been a distant dream, something she might pursue years from now after completing her bachelor's degree. To have it suddenly within reach was almost overwhelming. "I'll consider it," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Do that," Richardson replied. With a brief nod, he left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Elena remained in the empty classroom, processing everything that had happened. 6 weeks ago, she had been an anonymous older student, juggling multiple jobs while pursuing an education that many thought was impractical at her age. Now she was a published mathematician with a research position and the possibility of graduate school ahead of her, all because she had looked at an impossible problem and seen something no one else had seen, a doorway where others saw only a wall. As Elena gathered her books, her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at the daycare center. There was a staff party that evening to celebrate the holidays, and everyone had been asking if Elena would attend. "The kids made you cards," the message said with a smiling emoji. Elena smiled, typing a quick reply that she'd be there. Her life was changing rapidly, but some connections remained important. The children she had cared for over the years deserved a proper goodbye before she reduced her hours. Walking across the winter campus toward her next class, Elena reflected on Professor Richardson's words about impossible problems. She had faced many in her life: financial challenges, educational barriers, societal expectations about who could be a mathematician and when that journey should begin. Each of those impossible problems had required a transformation, a new way of seeing what was possible. Just as in mathematics, the solution often came not from following established pathways, but from creating new ones. The winter sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the quad. Elena turned her face toward the warmth, feeling a deep sense of validation not just in her mathematical abilities, but in the perseverance that had brought her to this moment. Some would call her story unusual or exceptional, but Elena knew better. The world was full of people with untapped potential, waiting for an opportunity or the courage to challenge what others had labeled impossible. Her journey wasn't just about mathematics. It was about the human capacity to transform limitations into possibilities. As she reached the science building, Elena paused to look back at the path she had traveled, both literally and figuratively. The impossible wasn't always impossible after all. Sometimes it was just waiting for someone with a fresh perspective to walk confidently to the board and show a new way forward.